The scratches were too high to reach. That was the first thing that bothered me, that they were fresh, or deep, or even that they were there at all. It was the height. They ran vertically along the wooden siding beside the back door, 4 parallel lines starting just below the roofline and ending above where my eyes naturally settled. I stood there longer than I should have, neck tilted back, trying to picture the angle, the reach, the leverage required to make marks like that without using a ladder. The wood was splintered inward, not scraped sideways, pressed, tested behind me. The yard was silent, not quiet in the normal sense. Silent the way a place feels when something has just passed through and taken the sound with it. No insects, umber, wind in the trees, even the distant road, usually a low, constant hiss of dyers might as well have been miles away. I remember thinking how clean it felt. Too clean, like the space was waiting to be used again. I didn't understand what that meant yet. I live on the edge of a rural township that barely qualifies as one. A handful of homes, a volunteer fire station, a closed-down general store that still had its faded sign bolted in place, like an apology. Beyond that, the land folds inward on itself, fields thinning into tree lines collapsing into forest that most people around here only skirt, never enter. It's the kind of place where everyone pretends they're more isolated than they really are, until something goes wrong and suddenly you see headlights where you weren't expecting them. The property I rented backed directly into that forest. No fence, no clear boundary. Just grass that gave up slowly, turning into weeds, then brush, then trees. When I moved in, the landlord mentioned wildlife the way people always do casually, dismissively. Deer, coyotes, occasionally a bear passing through. He didn't say it like a warning, more like a fact of life, the way you mentioned bad cell service or hard winters. The scratches showed up 3 months after I moved in. At first, I tried to rationalize them. Maybe a fallen branch, dragged upward somehow. Maybe old damage I hadn't noticed. I even grabbed a chair and stood on it, running my fingers along the grooves, feeling how uneven they were, not torn, not jagged, pressed in with intent. 4 lines, evenly spaced, each one ending with a shallow divot where whatever made them had stopped pushing. That night, I locked the back door. I don't usually. Out here, doors are more about habit than necessity. Still, I slid the bolt home and double-checked the latch, then stood there listening, waiting for the forest to make noise again. It didn't. That's when it started. Over. The next week, I noticed patterns that didn't make sense on their own, but stacked up in ways that felt deliberate. The deer stopped crossing the field behind my house. Not gradually, all at once. One morning there were tracks cutting through the frost, and the next there was nothing. The birds followed. I woke up one day and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard them near the tree line. Even the crows kept their distance, circling wide, never landing. I told myself predators do that. Large ones. They shift the balance. Things move away. What bothered me was how close the balance shifted. One evening, just before dusk, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a mug, when something pale caught the corner of my eye. I looked up in time to see a shape withdraw, tall and narrow, slipping back between the trunks. It wasn't fast. It didn't bolt. It stepped away, as if it had only been checking something and decided it didn't need to anymore. Later, when I replayed it in my head, I realized it had been facing my house. I started keeping the lights on at night, not all of them just enough to break up the dark, to give the illusion of presence. The forest didn't react. No eyes reflecting back. No movement. Just that same hollow stillness pressing against the windows. The scratches didn't reappear. Not on the house, anyway. Instead, they showed up on the shed. Same height, same spacing. This time, on metal. The grooves were shallower, but the paint was peeled back in clean lines. The steel dented inward. I stood there with my hand raised, measuring again, feeling my pulse pick up as I tried to imagine a posture that would put something that tall, that strong, that close to my things, without leaving more signs behind. I didn't sleep much after that. When I did, my dreams were thin and shallow, snapping apart the moment I drifted too far. Silence crept into the house the same way it did outside, subtly, patiently. I started noticing it more than sound. The way the air felt heavier when nothing moved, the way pressure built in my ears, like altitude changes without the climb. Once, around 2 a.m, I thought I heard breathing just beyond the back wall. Slow, controlled. I lay there counting it until it stopped, then waited for it to start again. It didn't. We should have stopped right there. I say we because by then I wasn't the only one seeing things. My neighbor Tom lived about half a mile down the road. He'd been there most of his life. Knew the land. Knew what belonged and what didn't. When I mentioned the scratchies casually, like it was nothing, he didn't laugh. He didn't ask questions either. Just nodded once, like I'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. You seen it yet? He asked. I asked him what he meant, and he hesitated, just long enough to matter. He told me about the tracks near his barn. Large, bipedal for short stretches. Then dropping back down, about how his dogs refused to go out at night now, whining at the door instead of barking. About the way it circled his property but never crossed the open ground between his place and mine. Doesn't act right, he said. Not like it's hunting. That word, hunting, stuck with me. He stared past me toward the tree line, door tight. People call it a dogman, he said finally. I don't. I asked him why, because naming it makes people think they understand it, he said. And they don't. He didn't say the word again after that. A few nights later, I saw it again. This time, it didn't retreat. I was outside, taking trash to the bin, when I felt its eyes on me, heavy and focused, coming from the trees. I froze, bag hanging from my hand, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The shape stood just inside the forest, tall and broad now, its outline broken by shadow. I could make out shoulders, arms held slightly away from its sides, a head tilted forward in a way that suggested ears. I couldn't quite see. It didn't move toward me. It didn't bare teeth or growl, or do any of the things stories teach you to expect. It just watched, weight shifting once, like it was deciding something, then, slowly, it stepped backward. Not in fear, not in retreat, in repositioning. Later, I realized something else. It had put itself between me and deeper forest, like a barrier. I didn't understand why until the howling started. It came from far off at first, low, dragging sound that rose and fell unevenly, like something trying to remember how it was supposed to call. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a coyote. It didn't carry the sharpness of either. It felt intentional, placed. What unsettled me most was that it didn't sound like it came from a throat at all. It felt as if the forest itself was shaping the noise trees, distance, and air rearranging to imitate a call they'd heard too many times. The shape in the trees reacted instantly. It flinched, not much. Just a subtle tightening of posture, a shift of weight forward, then sideways, like it was calculating escape routes. Its head turned not toward the sound, but away from it, scanning the ground, the trees, the space around my house. It stayed there until the howling stopped. Then it was gone. That's when it changed. The forest closed in after that. Pa-eyed, walked during the day, felt different at night, narrower somehow, even though nothing physical had shifted. The air pressed closer. Sounds, when they came, felt misplaced, arriving from angles that didn't line up with the space I could see. I started noticing marks in the dirt that didn't match the animal traffic I was used to. Too deep, too deliberate, often overlapping, as if something large had doubled back on its own steps. The scratches appeared again, this time on a tree, same height, same spacing. Fresh sap weeping down the bark, sticky and bright in the beam of my flashlight. I stood there too long, light shaking in my hand, and felt the sudden certainty that whatever had made them wasn't finished with that spot. That it had stopped because it heard something or sensed it. That night, the howling came closer, not directly. It moved laterally, sliding along the perimeter of the forest, never crossing into the field. Each call seemed to probe a different angle, a different approach. The sound didn't echo the way it should have. It absorbed into the trees, flattening out, making it impossible to tell distance or direction. The shape returned. I saw its eyes, first low, amber glint, catching the porch light as it crouched near the tree line. They weren't fixed on me. They were locked on the forest behind it, tracking movement I couldn't see. Its breathing was audible now, fast and controlled, chest expanding and contracting with effort. It edged closer to the house. I realized then that it wasn't following me. It was hiding with me. The howling stopped abruptly, cutting off mid-note. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Thicker, charged. The shape pressed itself closer to the ground, shoulders hunched, head lowered. It didn't look powerful in that moment. It looked cornered. Something moved deeper in the trees. Not a shape, not a sound, a pressure shift, like the forest itself was adjusting to make room. The scratches on the tree began to make sense not as warnings, but as markers. Boundaries drawn high, out of reach, testing where something else would respond. I didn't realize what it had already done. Morning brought a false sense of normalcy. Light filtered through the trees, birds cautiously resumed their calls, and the field behind my house looked the same as it always had. I convinced myself I'd imagined the worst of it, that exhaustion and isolation had filled in gaps with fear. Tom didn't share my relief. He met me halfway down the road, eyes sunken, jaw tight. His barn door was hanging open behind him, hinges twisted, would split cleanly down the center. Inside, the floor was torn up, hay scattered, deep gouges carved into the concrete foundation. There was a fight, he said, but not here. He showed me the tracks leading away from the barn, two sets, overlapping in places, then diverging. One heavy, uneven, as if injured, the other clean, confident, never breaking stride. They didn't clash, he said quietly. One chased, the other ran. That night, I heard movement near the house again. The shape returned, limping now, one leg dragging slightly as it shifted position. It stayed close to the wall, pressing itself into the narrow space between the house and the shed. When it lifted its head, I saw more of its face than before elongated muzzle. Wet nose, teeth just visible behind lips pulled tight in tension. Its eyes flicked toward me once, not pleading, not threatening, acknowledging. The howling answered almost immediately, closer than ever. The shape bolted. It didn't run into the forest. It ran along the house, past the windows, skirting the light, using the structure as cover before disappearing around the far side. I heard heavy movement follow faster, smoother, never breaking rhythm, then silence, complete, absolute. I stood there long after, listening to nothing, understanding too late that the house hadn't protected me. It had marked me. I don't live there anymore. I moved within the month, citing structural issues, noise complaints, anything that sounded reasonable. The landlord didn't argue. He didn't ask questions, just nodded, the same way Tom had, like he already knew. The fear didn't leave with me. Silence does something to me now. When rooms go too quiet, when sound drops away all at once, my body reacts before my mind does. Muscles tense, breathing shallow. I find myself listening for patterns in nothing, for pressure shifts that signal movement I can't see. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the scratches, about how high they were, about how deliberate. Not signs of aggression, but of measurement, testing where one thing ended and another began. I still believe the werewolf was afraid. I just don't believe it was afraid of me. People online argue about dogmen all the time, what they are, where they come from, whether they're real. I don't read those threads anymore. They're too focused on the creature itself. They miss the behavior, whatever people want to call it. Something out there hunted a werewolf like prey. It didn't rush. It didn't announce itself. It moved the world around its target until the target had nowhere left to stand. That's not a fight. That's a hierarchy. And silence is how it communicates. Silence does more than communicate. It trains you. It teaches you how long to wait before moving again, how slowly to breathe, how to listen without focusing on anyone's sound. I didn't realize that at first. I thought I was just jumpy, overreacting to a bad stretch of nights. But habits form whether you intend them to or not, especially when fear is involved. I started arranging my life around noise. Fans stayed on, even in winter. Radios played softly in empty rooms. I kept the television running at night, volume low, just enough to blur the edges of quiet without drawing attention. It wasn't comfort I was after. It was texture, layers, something to interrupt the kind of silence that settles all at once, the kind that feels like it's pressing in from all directions. When the noise stopped unexpectedly, that's when I froze. It didn't matter where I was. Grocery store, office building, parking garage. If the ambient hum cut out too cleanly, my body reacted before my thoughts caught up. Muscles locked, breathing went shallow. I'd find myself standing perfectly still, eyes unfocused, listening for a change in pressure rather than sound. No one ever noticed. That's the part that still unsettles me most. How invisible that reaction is. How easy it would be to stand right next to someone like me and never realize what we're listening for. How many people might already be doing the same thing without knowing why? I stopped talking about the night altogether. Not just the werewolf, not just the dogman, everything connected to it. The house, the forest. Tom, silence became a private language, one I didn't want to translate for anyone else. The few times I tried, I could see the moment people's attention drifted, the exact second when the story stopped sounding real enough to matter. I don't blame them. If I hadn't been there, I wouldn't believe it either. But belief doesn't change behavior. Experience does. I still catch myself scanning rooms for vertical marks, door frames, corners, high shelves, any place something tall might test reach without committing to entry. I don't look for damage anymore, I look for absence, clean surfaces where something could have left a sign and chose not to. That restraint tells you more than aggression ever could. Once after I'd moved, I found a set of shallow grooves on the concrete wall of an underground parking structure near my apartment. They were faint, barely visible unless you caught them at the right angle, but the spacing was familiar. The height was wrong for any tool, too deliberate to be accidental. I stood there longer than I should have. Nothing happened. No silence fell, No pressure shift. Cars came and went. People passed without noticing me. The marks remained just marks, inert and unclaimed. Still, I parked somewhere else after that. It wasn't fear that drove the decision. It was alignment. An instinctive need to avoid standing in places that felt useful to something else. Places that could serve as boundaries, markers, or tests. That's what the scratches were, in the end. Not warnings. Not threats, coordinates. I thought about Tom again around that time. About how easily he'd accepted the situation. How little surprise showed on his face when I mentioned the marks. He'd lived with it longer than I had. Long enough to understand the hierarchy without naming it. That's probably why he used the word Dogman the way he did once. Reluctantly. Like passing along a tool you hope the other person never needs to use. I never heard from him again. Sometimes I search obituaries, scanning names from that county, checking dates. I tell myself I'm just being cautious, that it's better to know. But the truth is, I'm afraid of what it would mean if he simply disappeared instead. Disappearances fit the pattern better. The idea that whatever hunted the werewolf might still be active doesn't frighten me the way it used to. What frightens me is how patient it felt, how little urgency it showed, how willing it was to let things unfold on their own as long as space kept reshaping itself in its favor. That kind of intelligence doesn't rush. It waits for alignment. I've wondered more than once whether the werewolf ever realized what was happening to it, whether it understood that the ground it considered safe was being redefined piece by piece, that the things it hid behind structures, light, human presence were being mapped, learned, catalogued. When it pressed close to my house, it wasn't asking for help. It was using known variables. I was one of them. That realization changed how I see myself in quiet moments, how I understand my place in rooms, in buildings, in cities. We like to think human activity dominates space, that lights and noise and movement claim territory. But there are other ways to claim ground. Silence is one of them. I don't know if the Dogman ever needed to see me clearly. I suspect it didn't. Watching how fear behaves is more efficient than tracking bodies. Fear shows you what matters, where safety is assumed, what will be used again. And that's the lesson I carry with me now. When a space feels too still, I leave it. When sound drops away too cleanly, I change direction. When silence thickens instead of thinning, I stop. I don't wait to see why. Because the last thing I want is to become another useful reference point, another place something can stand near to measure its reach. I've learned that survival isn't about being unnoticed. It's about never becoming convenient. And if silence ever starts to feel intentional againeth, the world pauses the way it did out there. I won't wait to see what comes next. I already know how that story goes. Silence doesn't just communicate, it conditions. Once you recognize it as a signal instead of a background state, you start adjusting to it without realizing you're doing it. Your routines change, your posture changes. Even the way you choose where to stand in a room starts to feel deliberate. I didn't notice those shifts at first. They crept in quietly, folding themselves into habits that felt practical instead of fearful. I stopped standing near windows at night, not because I thought something was watching me, but because it felt wrong to offer a clear line of sight from outside to inside. I positioned furniture differently. Chairs angled away from doorways. Beds no longer centered under windows. None of it was conscious strategy at first. It was instinct catching up with experience. Noise became something I managed instead of endured. I kept sources of sound spaced out, overlapping just enough that if one stopped, another would still be there to soften the drop. Fans, radios, timers, anything that prevented silence from arriving all at once. Sudden quiet is what gets your attention. Gradual quiet gives you time to adjust. That difference matters. I learnt it the hard way. Once, late at night, the power went out without warning. No flicker, no warning hum. Just an abrupt absence, like the world had been unplugged. Every sound vanished at the same time, no refrigerator, no traffic bleed, no distant voices through walls. The silence slammed down so hard I couldn't breathe. I stood there in the dark, frozen, waiting for the pressure to change, waiting for that familiar sense of space rearranging itself. Nothing happened. The power came back minutes later, sounds rushing in all at once, leaving me shaken and embarrassed by my own reaction. But even then, I knew the difference. That silence. It had been accidental. The silence back there had never been. That's the distinction people miss. When they talk about quiet places, natural silence still breathes. It still shifts and flexes. What I felt in that forest what I occasionally feel echoes of now as curated, shaped, maintained silence with intent. I think about Tom more often than I should, about how easily he'd accepted the situation, how little he needed explained. He'd lived long enough under that pressure to recognize the rules without needing them spelled out. He understood that once something higher in the hierarchy starts adjusting space, resistance is pointless. You adapt or you're removed. I never asked him what happened after I left. I never reached out. Part of me hopes he moved away quietly, folded his life into somewhere louder and safer. Another part suspects he stayed, because people like Tom tend to accept things they can't change. I don't know which possibility is worst off. Every now and then, I come across references online that feel too familiar to ignore. Posts about livestock losses that don't make sense. Comments about woods going dead quiet before something happens. People arguing in circles about whether dogmen are real, missing the point entirely. Reality isn't the creature, it's the pattern. Whatever was hunting that werewolf didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need to prove anything. It simply moved through the environment in a way that forced everything else to respond. The werewolf adapted. The animals fled. People noticed without understanding why. That's how dominance works, when it doesn't need witnesses. I've realized something else over time, something that's harder to admit. The reason the werewolf stayed close to my house wasn't just fear, it was recognition. It understood that human spaces create noise, light, and unpredictability, that those things interfere with how the forest listens. Staying near me wasn't protection, it was camouflage, a way to blur its outline against activity that something else found inconvenient. I was caviar. That realization changed how I think about safety, about proximity, about the assumption that human presence is a deterrent. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's exactly what something uses to avoid being seen. That thought follows me more than any memory of claws or eyes. When I walk through parking garages now, I stay near the entrances. When I pass wooded areas, I pay attention to how sound behaves at their edges, not whether there is noise, but whether noise seems reluctant to cross certain boundaries. If it hesitates, I do too. I don't wait around to see what fills that hesitation, because if there's one thing I know now, it's that the worst predators don't chase loudly. They don't announce themselves. They let the world adjust first, let everything else telegraph where it's going to hide. Then they move. I don't know if whatever hunted that werewolf is still out there. I don't know if it ever needed to leave that forest. Maybe it learned everything it needed to right there, watching how fear behaved when pressed. Or maybe it learned something more useful, how people respond to silence. Either way, I've accepted that I won't get answers. That closure isn't part of how this works. Some hierarchies don't resolve. They persist. And silence is how they let you know you're still inside them. Silence has taught me something else. Too, it has a shape, not a sound, not a presence, but a contour you can feel if you stay still long enough. It presses differently depending on where you are, what's nearby, and how much space is being left unused. Most people move through rooms without noticing that kind of thing. They fill gaps, automatically footsteps, conversation, noise from devices never letting the quiet settle long enough to show its outline. I don't have that luxury anymore. When silence stretches instead of breaking, I start measuring without meaning to. Distance between objects, ceiling height, the way walls meet corners. I think about leverage, about how much vertical space something would need to test without committing to entry. It's not paranoia, it's orientation. That forest taught me that silence isn't absence. It's permission. The werewolf understood that. That's why it stayed close. That's why it used my house, my light, my presence as a buffer. It wasn't hiding from me. It was hiding with me, banking on the assumption that whatever hunted it would hesitate around human spaces. Just long enough for survival to matter. That assumption didn't save it. And that's the part I don't forget. If something can pressure a predator into behaving defensively, into treating houses like cover instead of obstacles, then it isn't reacting to the world the way we do. It's shaping it, teaching everything else where to stand, where to pause, where not to linger. That kind of intelligence doesn't need to be seen. It only needs compliance. I still live my life. I go to work. I talk to people. I laugh when it's expected. From the outside, nothing about me looks changed. But I listen differently now. I respect silence the way you respect a boundary you didn't build yourself. Because the last thing I want is to be standing somewhere, someday, when the quiet around me doesn't feel accidental anymore. I already know what that means.